Dear viewers, what would you do if someone asked you to risk everything you've worked for to help them? Today's story is about a young female police officer from Texas whose entire world changed when she received an impossible request from behind prison walls. This isn't just another story about breaking rules or crossing lines. This is about a choice that would test everything she believed in and transform two lives in ways neither could have imagined. Before we dive deep into this incredible journey, I want you to know that what you're about to hear will challenge how you think about justice, truth, and the power of one person's determination to do what's right. If stories like this move you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end because the story has twists you won't see coming. Let's begin with Rebecca Martinez, a 26-year-old officer who had spent her entire career following every rule, every protocol, every procedure to the letter. She wasn't one of those officers who bent the rules or looked the other way. Rebecca was different. Her colleagues respected her because she treated everyone with dignity, whether they were fellow officers, civilians, or even suspects. She had this quiet strength about her that made people listen when she spoke. Rebecca had always dreamed of working in law enforcement. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her father serve as a sheriff's deputy for over 20 years. He taught her that being a police officer meant more than just wearing a badge. It meant standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. It meant being the barrier between chaos and order. Most importantly, it meant never compromising your integrity, no matter what. After graduating from the police academy with top honors, Rebecca started her career at a busy precinct in Dallas. She worked traffic stops, domestic disputes, theft cases, everything a young officer handles. Her supervisors noticed her immediately. She was thorough, professional, and had this natural ability to de-escalate tense situations. Other officers started requesting to work shifts with her because they knew she had their backs. But Rebecca's dedication to doing things the right way sometimes put her at odds with others. When she witnessed questionable behavior from fellow officers, she reported it. When she saw corners being cut on paperwork, she spoke up. When supervisors tried to pressure her into handling cases differently, she stood firm. This earned her respect from some, but it also made her enemies. The breaking point came when her direct supervisor, Captain Williams, started making inappropriate advances. Williams was a man in his 50s who had been with the department for over 25 years. He had connections, influence, and a reputation for getting his way. When Rebecca politely but firmly rejected his advances, Williams didn't take it well. He started making her work life difficult, assigning her to the worst shifts, the most dangerous calls, and constantly questioning her reports. One evening, Williams called Rebecca into his office. The conversation started professionally enough, but quickly turned personal. He made it clear that her career advancement depended on being more cooperative with him. When Rebecca refused and made it clear she would report his behavior, Williams smiled coldly and told her she was making a big mistake. 2 weeks later, Rebecca received transfer orders. She was being reassigned to a maximum security correctional facility, 3 hours outside of Dallas. The official reason was staffing needs, but Rebecca knew the truth. Williams had used his influence to punish her for standing up to him. Instead of fighting the transfer and potentially damaging her career further, Rebecca accepted it with dignity. She packed her things and prepared for a completely different kind of law enforcement. The correctional facility was nothing like the police station. The moment she walked through those heavy steel doors, Rebecca felt the weight of the place. The air was thick with tension, the sounds were harsher, and the atmosphere was filled with an underlying current of danger that never went away. This wasn't about protecting and serving the community anymore. This was about maintaining order in a place where hope often went to die. Rebecca's job was to supervise inmates during their daily activities, escort them to different areas of the facility, and ensure security protocols were followed. She quickly learned that being a corrections officer required a different set of skills than being a street cop. Here, you had to read people differently, understand the unspoken rules, and maintain authority without escalating situations unnecessarily. Most of the inmates fell into predictable categories. There were the angry ones who challenged authority at every turn, the broken ones who had given up on life, the manipulators who tried to work the system, the quiet ones who just wanted to do their time and get out. Rebecca treated them all with the same professional respect she had shown everyone throughout her career. But after her first month at the facility, one inmate caught her attention in a way she didn't expect. His name was David Chun, and he was different from the others. David was serving a 15-year sentence for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Unlike most inmates, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He was polite to staff, helpful to other inmates, and never caused trouble. There was something about him that didn't fit the typical profile of someone who belonged in maximum security. David was in his early 30s, well-educated, and had worked as a quality control manager at a food processing company before his conviction. He spent most of his time in the prison library, reading everything he could get his hands on. Other inmates respected him because he helped them write letters to their families and assisted with legal paperwork. The guards generally liked him because he never gave them problems. Rebecca first noticed David during meal supervision. While other inmates talked, loudly argued, or ate in silence, David would sit quietly reading a book or writing in a notebook. He was always respectful when she gave instructions, never tried to engage in inappropriate conversation, and maintained appropriate boundaries. But there was something in his eyes, a sadness that seemed deeper than just being incarcerated. Over several weeks, Rebecca began to notice small things about David. He would sometimes stare out the windows during yard time with a look of profound regret. When he thought no one was watching, his composed facade would slip, and she could see the pain he was carrying. During mail call, he never received letters, never had visitors, and seemed completely isolated from the outside world. One evening during her rounds, Rebecca found David sitting alone in the common area staring at a photograph. When he saw her approaching, he quickly put it away, but not before she glimpsed what looked like a family photo. That's when she realized that beneath his calm exterior, David was carrying a burden that went far beyond his criminal conviction. The next day, during a routine cell inspection, Rebecca discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in David's personal belongings, she found a carefully organized folder containing documents, letters, and what appeared to be evidence related to his case. When she confronted him about it, David's response caught her completely off guard. He didn't deny having the materials. Instead, he looked directly at her and said something that would haunt her for weeks to come. He told her he was innocent, that he had been framed by his former employer, and that he had one last wish before he lost hope completely. He needed someone on the outside to help him prove his innocence. But more importantly, he needed someone to fulfill a promise he had made to his dying daughter. Rebecca stood there holding that folder, knowing that what happened next would define not just David's future, but her own as well. David's words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She stood frozen in his cell, the folder trembling slightly in her hands. Everything about this moment felt wrong, dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step could destroy everything she'd worked for. But something in David's voice, the quiet desperation mixed with dignity, made her stay and listen. He told her about his daughter, Emma, who had been only 8 years old when he was arrested. Emma had been battling leukemia, spending more time in hospital beds than playgrounds. During his trial, while lawyers argued about financial records and corporate policies, Emma's condition had worsened. David had made her a promise during one of their last visits before sentencing. He promised he would prove his innocence and come home to take her to see the ocean, something she had dreamed about, but never experienced. Emma had died 6 months into his sentence. David never got to fulfill that promise, never got to say goodbye properly, never got to show her the waves she had only seen in picture books. The guilt was eating him alive. But there was something else. Emma's mother, David's ex-wife, had received threatening phone calls after the trial. Someone wanted to make sure certain information stayed buried, and David believed his former employer was behind it. Rebecca found herself asking questions she never intended to ask. Why hadn't his lawyer pursued these leads? Why hadn't the evidence been presented properly? David's answers painted a picture of a legal system that had failed him, of corporate lawyers who had outmaneuvered an overworked public defender, of witnesses who had suddenly changed their stories or disappeared entirely. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about David's story, about the folder of documents, about a little girl who had died while her father sat in prison for crimes he claimed he didn't commit. She told herself this wasn't her problem, that getting involved would be professional suicide. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's face when he talked about Emma. The next morning, Rebecca made a decision that went against every instinct she developed as a law enforcement officer. During her lunch break, she drove to the nearest public library and started researching David's case. What she found in old newspaper articles and court records made her stomach turn. The case had been rushed through the system. Key witnesses had recanted their testimony after the trial. The company David had worked for had been investigated for safety violations multiple times. But somehow those investigations had always been dropped. Rebecca spent her days off digging deeper. She contacted journalists who had covered corporate crime, spoke with former employees of David's company, and slowly began to piece together a pattern of corruption that went far beyond what David had been accused of. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that David was telling the truth. But investigating was one thing. Acting on what she'd learned was something entirely different. Rebecca knew that helping an inmate in this way could cost her not just her job but potentially her freedom. If she was wrong about David, if this was all an elaborate manipulation, she would lose everything. But if she was right, an innocent man was rotting in prison while the real criminals walked free. The breakthrough came 3 months into her investigation. A former company executive dying of cancer and wanting to clear his conscience reached out to a reporter with evidence of the cover-up. Financial records, emails, and recordings that proved David had been framed. The executive had been pressured to falsify documents that made David appear guilty. While the real embezzlement had been orchestrated by senior management, Rebecca knew this was the moment of truth. She could take this information to the authorities through proper channels, but that would take months or years to work through the system. Or she could take a more direct approach, one that would require her to step outside her role as a corrections officer and become something she'd never been before, an advocate for justice, operating in the shadows. She chose the harder path, working with the journalist and the dying executive. Rebecca helped coordinate the release of the evidence to multiple news outlets simultaneously. She used her position at the prison to document David's exemplary behavior, to gather statements from other inmates about his character, and to build a case for his innocence that couldn't be ignored. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. By that evening, David's case was front-page news across Texas. The company executives who had framed him were arrested. The corrupt officials who had covered it up were under investigation. And David Chun, who had spent 3 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit, finally had hope again. But Rebecca's involvement hadn't gone unnoticed. Prison officials launched an internal investigation into how sensitive information about David's case had been leaked. They suspected someone on the inside had been helping him, and Rebecca knew it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots back to her. The night before David's conviction was officially overturned, he asked to speak with Rebecca privately. They met in the prison chapel, a quiet space where inmates often went to find peace. David thanked her for everything she'd done, but then he made another request, one that would test Rebecca's commitment even further. He asked her to help him fulfill the promise he'd made to Emma, not the original promise about proving his innocence, but a new one. He wanted to establish a foundation in Emma's name to help other children battling cancer, particularly those whose parents were facing legal troubles. He needed someone he trusted to help him navigate the outside world, to be his partner in building something meaningful. From the ashes of his destroyed life, Rebecca looked at this man who had lost everything, his daughter, his freedom, his reputation, and yet still wanted to use his experience to help others. She realized that fulfilling David's last wish wasn't just about clearing his name or seeking justice. It was about transformation, about taking pain and turning it into purpose, about honoring the memory of a little girl who had never gotten to see the ocean. As David walked out of prison, a free man the following week, Rebecca knew her own journey was just beginning. Rebecca stood at her apartment window 3 days after David's release, watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and pink. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from prison administrators, internal affairs investigators, and reporters who had somehow gotten her number. She let them all go to voicemail. There were bigger things happening now, things that mattered more than protecting her career. David had called her the night before. His voice sounded different outside those prison walls, lighter somehow, but still carrying the weight of everything he'd been through. He'd found a small apartment in Houston and was slowly adjusting to freedom. But he wasn't calling to talk about himself. He wanted to move forward with the foundation they'd discussed, and he needed her help to make it happen. Rebecca had spent years following orders, working within systems, trusting that institutions would do the right thing. But watching David's case had taught her that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, individuals have to step up and fill the gaps. She made a decision that morning that would reshape everything about her future. She submitted her resignation from the correctional facility. Her supervisor, Warden Martinez, called her into his office that afternoon. He was a decent man who had always treated Rebecca fairly, and she could see the disappointment in his eyes as he read her resignation letter. Martinez set the letter down and looked at her directly. He told her he knew she'd been involved in the Chun case, that the investigation had found evidence of her research activities, but he also told her something she hadn't expected. He said that in 30 years of corrections work, he'd rarely seen an officer show the kind of integrity she'd demonstrated. He couldn't officially condone what she'd done, but he understood why she'd done it. Rebecca left that meeting feeling a mix of relief and terror. She was walking away from steady income, benefits, and a career path she'd worked hard to build, but she was walking towards something that felt more important than any paycheck. The chance to be part of something that could make a real difference. David met her at a coffee shop in downtown Houston the following week. It was strange seeing him in civilian clothes, sitting across from her without bars or guards or institutional protocols between them. He looked older than his 33 years, but there was something in his posture that hadn't been there in prison. Hope, maybe, or determination. They talked for hours about the foundation. David had already been in contact with several hospitals and cancer research centers. He'd spoken with lawyers about the legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit organization. But what he needed was someone who understood investigations, someone who could help identify families who needed support, someone who could navigate the complex world of law enforcement and legal systems that often left families feeling helpless and alone. Rebecca found herself saying yes before she'd fully processed what she was agreeing to. Maybe it was the way David's eyes lit up when he talked about helping other families avoid what he and Emma had gone through. Maybe it was the realization that she'd spent her entire career trying to serve justice, and this felt like the purest form of that service she'd ever encountered. They spent the next 3 months laying the groundwork. Rebecca used her savings to cover living expenses while they applied for nonprofit status, developed program guidelines, and reached out to potential donors. David threw himself into the work with an intensity that was almost frightening. He would stay up until 3 o'clock in the morning researching funding opportunities, writing grant applications, and reaching out to medical professionals who might want to partner with them. Rebecca worried about him sometimes. She could see that he was channeling all his grief about Emma into this project, and she wondered if he was dealing with his emotions in a healthy way. But she also recognized that purpose was powerful medicine, and David seemed to draw strength from the idea that his daughter's memory would live on through their work. The Emma Foundation officially launched 6 months after David's release from prison. Their first case came through a referral from a social worker at Children's Hospital. A single mother named Maria Santos was facing bankruptcy while trying to pay for her son's cancer treatments. Her ex-husband had been arrested on drug charges, leaving her to handle everything alone. She was overwhelmed by medical bills, legal paperwork, and the constant fear of losing her child. Rebecca drove to Maria's apartment on a Saturday morning, bringing groceries and a folder full of resources the foundation had compiled. She sat at Maria's kitchen table, helping her organize medical bills and insurance paperwork while 8-year-old Carlos played video games on an old tablet. The boy was thin and pale from chemotherapy, but his smile reminded Rebecca powerfully of the photographs she'd seen of Emma. That evening, Rebecca called David to update him on the visit. She could hear the emotion in his voice as she described Carlos, how he'd asked if she wanted to see his drawings, how he told her about wanting to be a doctor when he grew up so he could help other sick kids. David was quiet for a long moment after she finished talking. Then he said something that made Rebecca understand the true depth of what they were doing together. He told her that for the first time since Emma died, he felt like he was keeping his promise to her. Not the original promise about proving his innocence, but a deeper one about making sure other children didn't have to face what she had faced alone. Over the following year, the foundation grew beyond what either of them had imagined possible. They helped dozens of families navigate the complex intersection of medical crises and legal troubles. They provided financial assistance for treatments, connected families with pro bono legal services, and created support groups where parents could share their experiences without judgment. Rebecca discovered she had a gift for this work. Her law enforcement background helped her cut through bureaucracy and advocate effectively for families dealing with overwhelmed social services systems. Her natural empathy made her someone parents trusted with their deepest fears and most desperate needs. She found herself working longer hours than she ever had as a police officer, but feeling more fulfilled than she'd ever thought possible. David had transformed as well. The broken man she'd met in prison had become a passionate advocate who could speak to corporate executives and medical professionals with equal skill. He testified before state legislative committees about the need for better support systems for families facing medical crisis. He spoke at conferences about criminal justice reform and the importance of second chance. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to both of them. The phone call from a mother whose son had completed treatment successfully. The graduation photo from a teenager who'd beaten cancer while her father served time for a mistake he'd made years earlier. The thank you letter from a family who said the foundation had helped them hold on to hope when everything else seemed lost. One evening, almost exactly 2 years after David's release, Rebecca was working late at the foundation's small office when her phone rang. It was David, and his voice carried an excitement she hadn't heard before. He'd just gotten off a call with a major pharmaceutical company that wanted to partner with the foundation on a new program providing free medications for children whose families couldn't afford them. As Rebecca listened to David describe the partnership opportunity, she realized something profound had happened. They had taken the worst experiences of their lives, his wrongful imprisonment and her professional exile, and transformed them into something that was changing other people's lives for the better. David's last wish had evolved into something neither of them had imagined when they first started working together. The little girl who had never gotten to see the ocean was now helping other children navigate storms of their own. And the police officer who had risked everything to help a prisoner was discovering that sometimes the most important laws are the ones written in the human heart. But their story was far from over. Rebecca sensed that David was building towards something even bigger, something that would test both of their commitments in ways they hadn't yet imagined. That something bigger came sooner than either of them expected. 3 months later, Rebecca received a call that would test everything they had built together. It was from a detective in Dallas, someone she had worked with years earlier during her time as a police officer. Detective Rodriguez's voice was tense as he explained the situation. A major investigation had uncovered a network of corporate corruption that went far beyond David's original case. The same company that had framed David was now facing federal charges for systematically covering up safety violations that had led to serious illnesses and deaths. The investigation had revealed a pattern of targeting whistleblowers, destroying evidence, and using their legal connections to silence anyone who threatened their operations. But there was a problem. Several key witnesses had disappeared or refused to testify. Terrified of the company's reach and influence, the prosecutors needed someone who understood the company's methods, someone who had already proven they were willing to stand up to powerful interests. They needed David to testify not just about his own case, but about everything he had observed during his time working there. Rebecca could hear the fear in David's voice when she called to tell him about the request. He had spent 3 years in prison. Because of these people, he had lost his daughter while fighting for his innocence. Now they were asking him to put himself back in the crosshairs of the same forces that had destroyed his life once before. The decision wasn't just about David's safety. If he testified, it would mean stepping away from the foundation during its most critical growth period. It would mean reliving the trauma of his conviction, facing hostile lawyers who would try to discredit him, and risking everything they had built together. But it also meant the chance to prevent other families from going through what he and Emma had endured. Rebecca found herself in a familiar position, caught between the safe choice and the right choice. She could encourage David to focus on the foundation to protect the good work they were doing and avoid the risks of getting involved in another legal battle. Or she could support him in taking on a fight that was bigger than both of them, one that could expose a system of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. They met at the small park where David often went to think, the same park where he had scattered Emma's ashes after his release from prison. As they sat on a bench watching children play on swings and slides, Rebecca could see David wrestling with the decision. His hands were shaking slightly, and she recognized the signs of someone reliving traumatic memories. David told her about the nightmares that had started again since the detective's call. He described lying awake at night, remembering the feeling of being completely powerless as his life was systematically destroyed by people who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to their profits. He talked about the guilt he still carried over Emma's death, wondering if things might have been different if he had been more careful, more strategic in how he had tried to expose the company's wrongdoing. But then David's voice changed, becoming stronger and more determined. He told Rebecca about a conversation he'd had with Maria Santos the week before. Maria's son, Carlos, was now in remission, healthy and happy, and looking forward to starting middle school. Maria had thanked David for everything the foundation had done for her family, but she had also said something that stuck with him. She told him that the foundation's work was important, but the real gift he had given her was hope. Hope that good people still existed, that someone would fight for families like hers when they couldn't fight for themselves. David looked at Rebecca and said something that made her understand the true measure of the man she had chosen to partner with. He told her that Emma would have wanted him to fight not just for other sick children, but for all the families who were facing powerful enemies they couldn't defeat alone. He said that testifying wasn't just about seeking justice for what had happened to him. It was about preventing future Emma Chens from losing their parents to corporate greed and systematic corruption. Rebecca felt a familiar sensation, the same feeling she had experienced in David's prison cell 2 years earlier when she first decided to help him. It was the recognition that some moments define who you are, and backing down isn't really an option when you understand what's at stake. She told David she would support whatever decision he made, but she also shared her own perspective. During her years in law enforcement, she had seen too many cases where the powerful escaped consequences while ordinary people paid the price for their crimes. She had watched families destroyed by systems that were supposed to protect them. David's testimony could be the key to breaking a cycle of corruption that had been operating for years. More importantly, Rebecca reminded David of something he seemed to have forgotten in his fear. He wasn't the same man who had been railroaded 3 years earlier. He wasn't alone anymore. He had allies, resources, and a platform that could amplify his voice in ways that hadn't been possible during his original trial. The foundation had given him credibility and connections that would make it much harder for his enemies to silence him. David agreed to testify. The months leading up to the trial were intense and exhausting. Rebecca found herself serving as David's protector, advocate, and emotional support system. All at once, she coordinated with federal prosecutors, helped prepare David for cross-examination, and worked with security experts to ensure his safety. She also kept the foundation running, delegating responsibilities to staff members and volunteers while maintaining the programs that families like Maria's depended on. The trial itself was a media sensation. Day after day, David sat in the witness stand describing a culture of corruption that had prioritized profits over human lives. He testified about safety reports that were buried, about employees who were fired for raising concerns, about a systematic effort to cover up evidence of dangerous practices that had sickened and killed consumers across multiple states. Rebecca watched from the gallery as David faced down the same lawyers who had destroyed his life years earlier. But this time was different. David was prepared, supported, and armed with documentation that couldn't be discredited or explained away. When the defense attorneys tried to paint him as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, David calmly pointed to the Foundation's work and asked why someone motivated by revenge would spend his freedom helping children and families, rather than pursuing personal gain. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty verdicts on all major charges, prison sentences for the executives who had orchestrated the cover-up, financial penalties that would fund victim compensation and corporate oversight for years to come. But for Rebecca, the real victory came in the weeks following the trial. Phone calls from other whistleblowers who had been afraid to come forward. Now, emboldened by David's example, letters from families who had lost loved ones to corporate negligence, thanking them for proving that justice was still possible. Invitations from other organizations who wanted to partner with the foundation to expand their work to new communities and new causes. Standing in the foundation's office 6 months after the trial, Rebecca looked at the wall where they had hung photos of all the families they had helped. Dozens of smiling children, grateful parents, success stories that had emerged from some of the darkest moments in these families' lives. In the center of the wall was a photo of Emma Chen, the little girl who had never gotten to see the ocean, but whose memory had inspired waves of change that were still spreading outward. David appeared beside her, following her gaze to Emma's photo. He was different now than he had been even a year earlier. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had found his purpose. He told Rebecca that he had been thinking about expanding the foundation's work, maybe establishing chapters in other states, maybe developing new programs to address the intersection of medical crises and legal troubles in underserved communities. Rebecca smiled, recognizing the tone in David's voice. It was the same tone he had used when he first described his dream of helping other families avoid what he and Emma had experienced. But now his dreams had the weight of proven success behind them and the resources to make even bigger changes possible. As they stood there planning the future, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had started as a police officer, trying to serve justice within established systems. Then she had become a corrections officer working to maintain order in a broken institution. Finally, she had found her calling as an advocate operating outside traditional structures, using her skills and experience to fight for people who had nowhere else to turn. David's last wish had been simple in concept, but profound in its implications. He had wanted someone to help him prove his innocence and honor his daughter's memory. But fulfilling that wish had required Rebecca to risk everything she had worked for, to step outside her comfort zone and to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. The foundation was thriving, but Rebecca knew their work was far from finished. Every day brought new calls from families facing impossible choices, new stories of people caught between medical crises and legal troubles they couldn't navigate alone. Each case reminded her that David's original wish had evolved into something much larger, a commitment to ensuring that no family would have to face these challenges without support and advocacy. Dear viewers, sometimes fulfilling one person's last wish becomes the beginning of something that changes countless lives. Rebecca Martinez thought she was helping one innocent man clear his name and honor his daughter's memory. Instead, she discovered that true justice isn't just about following rules or working within systems. Sometimes it requires individuals to step outside their roles, take risks, and fight for what's right even when the odds seem impossible. David Chen's last wish wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about transforming pain into purpose, turning personal tragedy into a force for positive change, and ensuring that a little girl's dream of seeing the ocean would live on through the lives of other children who needed someone to fight for them. Their story reminds us that the most important promises aren't always the ones we make to the living. Sometimes they're the ones we make to memories, to principles, and to futures we may never see but hope to make possible for others.